stormy winter, staying here tonight.
Aliyah Shindiggers, my name is Steve Holroyd. By my side, as always, is Sam the Wonder Pug. And welcome to the first episode of The Front Row, a podcast where I will be offering cold takes, if you will, on North American soccer. Cold, because I'll be dealing mostly with history, although from time to time I may occasionally rant and rave about current events going on in the sport. As Admiral Stockdale once famously asked, who am I? Why am I here? As those of you who follow me on Twitter know, I am a Philadelphia-based labor law attorney, and lately some of you have got to read and see my skills in action as soccer is inundated with lawsuits over collective bargaining agreements and no strike clauses and fair pay and antitrust and any one of a number of other legal matters that have been popping up across the American soccer landscape. But I'm also an American soccer historian. How does one become an American soccer historian? Well, that's an interesting story, and I'll save it for another podcast. But I trust if you're listening, you've had the chance to read some of my articles at the Philly Soccer page or on the Society for American Soccer History page, or some of my year in review articles that I've written for the American Soccer History Archives webpage. But I've since concluded that no one really reads anymore. We're all too busy. We're driving to work, we're driving our kids to soccer games, soccer practices. So I decided to do a podcast. I've been thinking about it for quite some time. And this past weekend, I listened to a number of hockey history podcasts where, frankly, the bar was so low that I figured, why not? So here I am, and here we go. For this first episode, I wanted to discuss why there isn't more soccer history out there. And along those lines, I should mention now, there is one other soccer history podcast out there right now. It's called Soccer History USA by Dr. Brian D. Bunk, and it's an excellent and entertaining series. Currently, he's doing a bunch of You Are There pieces focusing on the American Soccer League of the 1920s, doing like a season-by-season weekly review almost, and it includes period music, ads, things like that, and of course reports of the teams and the stars. It's a lot of fun, and you also learn something along the way. But other than that, and other than the fine written work by people like Colin Jost, Roger Alloway, Ed Farnsworth, and some others, there's really a dearth of U.S. soccer history out there. And it begs the question, why is that? About a year ago, MLS Commissioner Don Garmer announced to a British audience that the United States does not have 100 years of soccer history. And, of course, the pro-relics went wild, blew up our soccer media feeds with their outrage and claims that this was part of MLS's attempt to, further control U.S. soccer by downplaying its history. And part of the grand MLS Illuminati conspiracy to keep the panacea of promotion and relegation away from the huddled masses, blah, 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 blah. And make no mistake, Garber was wrong. But he was also correct. Now let's take a step back. More than in any other country, professional sports takes up a huge place in American life. I mean, we have the Super Bowl, the World Series, the Olympics, which I know is international, but I mean, sporting events. When there's a sporting event, Americans will drop what they're doing, go and watch. And Americans' fascination with sports goes beyond these big events. We are also fascinated by the various teams and the players who make up those teams, or who have made up those teams, in the past. that fascination extends to the history of each respective sport. I mean, we have dozens of films, hundreds of books, and thousands of hours of conversation in bars and living rooms that have been devoted to such age-old questions like, was Jordan better than Wilt? Or is today's NHL weaker than the original six era? Or could Jim Brown run for 2,000 yards in today's NFL? Things like that. Notably absent from these discussions is anything about U.S. professional soccer. Now, it's not for a lack of history. I mean, Major League, Division I, if you will, professional soccer has been played in this country off and on since the 1920s. However, I think it's the lack of any lineal history that is the reason why we don't really talk about it too much. I mean, that is, the teams we know today do not go back beyond 1996, with all due respect to Seattle and Portland and Vancouver and some other clubs that have tried to reach back. I mean, MLS has been around since 1996. And that fact, coupled with the virtual absence of any film or statistics to refresh recollections, makes it difficult to wax nostalgic about pro soccer the way we do about other sports. In fact, let me state it another way, because I got this idea about a year or so ago. I was watching a documentary about the closing of Boston Garden, and they showed the Boston Bruins brought out all these stars from the teams of the past. You know, those Ray Bork, Bobby Orr and Phil Esposito, the obvious ones, but there was also, you know, Johnny Busick and Derek Sanderson and Ted Green, I think he was there, going back to Milt Schmidt, who played on the Kraut line in the 40s. And the fans were cheering, standing, applauding, and I dare say a lot of the people in the Garden, other than Orr, Esposito, and Bork, probably had very little idea who they were cheering for, but it didn't matter because they were old Bruins. They were wearing the sweater, you know, and they felt a connection. You know, like along those lines, even if you're a casual hockey fan, you might be interested in watching a documentary about Eddie Shore, even if you only know that name as a punchline from Slapshot, because he played for the Bruins. And your familiarity with the Bruins makes the subject more interesting, because then you can compare Shore to other current and past stars, and this in turn generates conversation about an all-time Bruins team and things like that. The bottom line being, you have an unbroken link to the past. And that link is the Bruins. That link is your team. No different with the Phillies. You know, you see people you go to a Phillies game and they're wearing caps from the 50s era or the 1915 World Series team. They're wearing the replica, just, you know, black hat with a white P on it. But it resonates because it's an old Phillies cap. There's a connection there. Conversely, we don't have that in soccer. I mean, we can talk about, say, Archie Stark. And we can talk about the brilliance of a 67 goals in 44 game season in 1924-25, but there's really no way to link that feat to anything that is around today, because the teams he did it against, you know, Fall River Marksmen, New Bedford Whalers, New York National Giants, they're long gone. The league he did it in, the American Soccer League, the original version, is long gone. Indeed, the team he played for, Bethlehem Steel, is long gone, notwithstanding the recent attempt to resurrect the brand in the USL. So there's the problem. You know, there's a disconnect between then and now that makes history a little less relevant. That's the hand we've been dealt as American soccer fans. So what does it mean? I think what it means is that, unlike Don Garber, we need to work a little harder at embracing and publicizing this history. Now, we know MLS does a terrible job of talking about the past at all. Frankly, it's enough to get them to reference their own past when we're talking about records and things like that. But it always particularly galled me when, like a couple of years ago, when Wondolowski and I guess Bradley Wright Phillips were chasing MLS goal records. Yeah, they talked about Roy Lassiter, which was fine, but you know, you think a passing reference to the records of Giorgio Chinaglia in the 80s, scoring for the New York Cosmos, might have been worthwhile. Or even Archie Stark in the American Soccer League, just as a point of reference. MLS doesn't do that. Teams and clubs in the North American Soccer League and MLS have done a better job by naming their teams after the storied clubs of the past. But, that's really resurrecting the badge. But as I see it, little else. You don't really see a whole lot of talk about history. Cosmos do a decent job, but really, other than that, not so much. And that's not enough. It's up to us. I mean, where the leagues aren't doing it, the clubs aren't doing it, we have currently a pretty moribund Hall of Fame that is not in a position to do it. It's up to us. And the timing couldn't be better in that U.S. soccer supporters, the U.S. soccer supporter culture has elevated the status of the game in this country to levels it's never seen. I mean, supporters literally brought a team to Philadelphia in MLS. And supporters in their work have also resulted in teams like Seattle and Portland getting promoted, yes, I said promoted, into MLS. Supporters have done a lot for the game in just the last 10, 15 years. So it's only fitting that it should be up to us to bring U.S. soccer history out of the closet. We need to remember Billy Gonzalez, Bert Patinaude, Walt Barr, Ruben Mendoza, Steve Moyers, Ricky Davis, Bob Rigby, Shep Messing, Al Trost, and all these Americans who starred in eras when being an American was a real huge disadvantage. And indeed, American was a dirty word where the ethnic clubs and later, to quote Shep Messing, the English mafia was dominating the pro game and semi-pro game in this country through the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. And hopefully this podcast might start generating some discussion and be a positive step in the direction of bringing soccer history out into the open. So that's where I want to go, and that's what I want to do. I have a couple of topics coming up, but I'm always happy to take requests, if you will. I'm always happy to talk about other American history topics that I might not have touched on before. And so I'm always looking for suggestions. You can follow me on Twitter at section 107 row A. You can email me at soccermaven, that's soccermavn at yahoo.com. And, together we can have some fun and bring the great history that soccer has in this country out into the open. So that's it for this first broadcast on behalf of, again, myself and Sam the Wonder Pug. Thanks for listening, and I hope to touch base with you in the near future.
We always knew you'd be the one to drive a fancy car, and now we're happy to see you succeeding everywhere you are. 'Cause you're keener than Keegan, and you're better than best. We always knew you'd go far. You're a 70s football star.